Verse 14 and 15 kind of continue the same theme about how that in verse 13, these same people are boasting about their flesh. If they're Jews boasting over the Gentiles, then perhaps they're boasting in their superiority as Jews. In other words, they're boasting in the superiority of their Jewish heritage or the Jewish ethnicity over Gentile heritage. Paul's going to be writing the letter to Galatians and explaining to the Gentile Galatians that in order to join this members-only club called Israel, you don't have to undergo this change in your status because of some deficiency that is in your status as ethnic Gentiles. So there's this boasting going on, and it's with that that Paul explains in verse 14 as we pick up my commentary now. Far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. Now, why would Paul highlight this fact as over and against the boasting that his fellow countrymen were fond of doing? Why would Paul not, for instance, boast himself about being a Jew, or boast himself about keeping the law, or boast himself about having access to God himself? Why wouldn't he also boast? I mean, he had a right to. He was a Jew. He was circumcised in the 8th day. He was of the tribe of Benjamin, right? He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. We read about these qualifications that he talks about himself in another one of his letters. I think it's the book of Philippians. But here's what I have to say in my commentary. And I brought this verse into my commentary because it's common to find in standard Christian commentaries and to hear this in Christian sermons that Paul minimized his Jewishness once he became a believer. Paul himself didn't really even think of himself as a Jew anymore. He didn't have to focus on the external Jewish ethnicity that he was born with. He didn't really care about his circumcision anymore, and he certainly didn't focus on Torah observance anymore. He basically led his life as a Christian, which unfortunately for 21st century application, whenever we describe Paul as just living as a Christian, unfortunately the default viewpoint that's presented in today's sermons and in today's Christian commentaries, when I use the word default, and I use the word unfortunately, is basically it describes a Gentile from the Jewish perspective. So that's kind of the setting that this verse is set in, that it's cast in for most people when they approach it. And here's why I wrote my short little one paragraph comment. Here's what I have to say. In stark contrast to boasting about one's ethnic status as a Jew, Paul proudly confesses that he will never boast about anything save his trusting faithfulness in the cross of his Lord Yeshua. This does not mean that he considers Jewish identity worthless. This is why I wrote this part of the commentary. Paul doesn't consider Jewish identity worthless. Rather, he knows how to prioritize what is most important against those details that are of lesser importance. That's really, I think, what he means when he says, far be it from me to boast. We in the current Messianic /Torah movement could stand to learn a lot from Paul's example. Sadly, all too often, I go on to say in my notes here, we are found to be quibbling about the ethnic identity of this person and the ethnic identity of that person, but what we should be focusing on is the identity of the man, capital N, capital M, of the man from Galilee, and how his righteousness has graciously paid the price for our sin. Amen? So, in other words, just briefly, what I'm trying to say is I don't think that Paul is trying to say that he doesn't care about being Jewish anymore. To be sure, later on, if we were to go look at that same passage in Romans chapter 2 and keep reading into the next chapter, he actually talks about that there is an advantage to being Jewish. There is an advantage to being circumcised physically. In other words, Jewish ethnicity carries some advantages to it. And this was written post-resurrection, so obviously Paul can't be describing some type of advantages that existed only before he came to Messiah, and then that now that he comes to Messiah, everything else is just rubbish. That can't be the case. So I think what Paul's just simply trying to challenge us is to prioritize, and this is helpful for us because we're going to look at this in my next comment here.